Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. This is the Power Hungry Podcast, and I am pleased that you're with me and pleased that you're ready to hear our new guest, Michael Shellenberger. This podcast is new. I talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics because politics are often involved in energy, or almost always involved in energy and power systems. So, Michael, it's great to have you on. We're going to talk about your new book, Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. But I want you, if you don't mind, to introduce yourself. I mean, I've been introduced. I never quite like the introductions that people give me. So if you were just introducing yourself to, I'm putting you on the spot here, introducing yourself to someone, how would you, someone that you've just met and you're going to be in the train car or a bus with them for the next hour and a half. Please, who are you?
I would say, good question. So I'm the president of Environmental Progress. I have a small research and policy organization, and I am the author of a new book called Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All.
Oh, well, that sounds like a cool book. Tell me about the book.
Well, what do you want to know, Robert? You read it.
Well, I have read it, and I have to say, and thanks. I appreciate you taking that on. The book is great, and one of the things that I really like about it is the human approach. And what my takeaway from the message in the book is this: your extreme humanism, and that bringing humanism back to environmentalism instead of, as you put it, I think toward the end of the book, about the moving away from environmental apocalypse, apocalyptic visions of the environment, to one that's a humanist view of the environment and our role in it. So tell me about that. I mean, my first question I have here is this idea about apocalypse as identity and the religious nature of the debate. And you even have a chapter, False Gods for Lost Souls. You talk about the new environmental religion that has become increasingly apocalyptic, destructive, and self-defeating. What is this religion?
Well, that's a heavy beginning, Robert.
let's jump right in.
Jeez, I thought we were just going to talk about the environment.
It's your book, man.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. And, I'm a huge fan of Juice and a huge fan of A Question of Power and of all your books. And, it's been such a crazy news environment. I've got this rave review of Juice coming out. And I've just been wanting it to come out at the right time so that it doesn't disappear into the chaos of the end of civilization or whatever is going on.
Is there other news happening?
Is there something going on?
What was? Did I miss something? Was this the asteroid?
I mean, yeah, it's funny to write a book about that is about apocalypse or the fear of the apocalypse at a moment that feels so apocalyptic. And and I see a lot of what's happening now. I can't help but see a lot of what was happening last year on climate change and what's happening now. It feels like a religious revival. And so that's very much, as you alluded to, a big part of what I was getting at, which is sort of what's going on. Apocalypse Never is 12 chapters. The first 4 or 5 chapters are sort of how I think we should think about environmental problems, which I think are very real or very serious. They're what I've dedicated my life to addressing. And I also want to kind of pull apart the parts that we have good science and evidence for and what's exaggeration and alarmism and apocalyptic. And then I wanted to kind of say, well, then how do we save nature? And that's kind of the middle of the book, how humans save nature. And the people that know me know that I am a huge supporter of nuclear energy. So that's there. My criticisms of renewables are there. And also a story about how we save nature through energy transitions and moving to cities and industrialization. And then you get to the last 3 chapters, and that's where I ask, why is it that the people who say they are most concerned about environmental problems, who say they're the most alarmist about environmental problems, are the most opposed to all of the really obvious solutions? Like if you're worried about us running out of food, why are you against using fertilizer, tractors, and irrigation? If you're apocalyptic about climate change, why would you not want to switch from coal to natural gas and to nuclear? And that was the hardest part of the book to write, it's interesting that the last chapter I didn't even finish until the very last minute, because I was literally still felt like I was getting to the bottom of that question. And so those last 3 chapters are, just roughly speaking, it's power, money, and religion. Or no, sorry, money, power, and religion. And it was my way of saying all 3 things are really important to understanding what's behind the apocalyptic environmentalism, and they should all be taken seriously as major drivers of it. But at the end, I do kind of think that the last one is the biggest one, which is the religious, the need for faith, the need to believe in something really big.
Well, and you talk from very early in the book, you talk very early about this. In fact, you debunk the claims that the California wildfires were caused by climate change. And I was just listening to Greta Thunberg's new podcast, in which she talks specifically about the wildfires and conflates the whole idea that it's being caused by climate change. But you said early in the book, just to, that apocalyptic idea, and that we're going to be burned up, is a convenient parallel, right? That we're going to burn in hell. But you say early in the book, the bottom line is that other human activities have a greater impact on the frequency and severity of forest fires than the emissions of greenhouse gases. But that's almost, well, it is heretical in this, the messaging that we continue to hear from Greta and many other people that are preaching this or putting forward this same kind of apocalyptic narrative. So my question is, well, one, why has Greta Thunberg become such the prophet of doom and has been embraced by so many people? And I guess, is it because she's preaching this? She said, "What, I don't want you to be comfortable. I want you to panic." You quote her as well in the early part of the book.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's a lot there in your question.
A lot there, yeah.
So, I felt the need to do a book, in part because I felt like the Twitter and even the article length explanations of my views and how I think about climate change and environmental problems required the space of a book to be able to explain and unpack these things for people, as well as have a significant amount of footnotes. 25% of the book, it's over 400 pages, and 25% are just the end notes. So, on really a lot of these problems, really most or maybe all the most important ones, other factors are outweighing climate change in terms of forest fires, flooding, hurricane damage, and the death toll from natural disasters. And so it's just all the stuff that we would know it would be, and also for agriculture, of course. So it's all the stuff that we would know it would be. If you, what determines how big your floods are depend on whether you have a flood management system. Do you live in Berkeley, where I'm on the hills, and if I didn't have this elaborate system to channel rainwater every year, then our houses would just slide into the bay.
Sure.
Whereas in the Congo, they don't have that system, and so they have mudslides and they have all the flooding problems. And you can just kind of go down the list, including on forests. Now, I don't know to what extent Greta Thunberg is just unaware of the science, or to what extent she's misrepresenting it. I'm not going to speculate, and I don't speculate as to why, but I did want to spend the time going through that. And none of it's to say that climate change is not a concern or should not be a concern, or that at some point in the future it wouldn't have greater impact. But certainly for now, it's being outweighed by these other impacts.
Sure. Well, and I notice in the first pages of the book, you have one sentence referring to coronavirus, right? You're saying in 2020, I've forgotten the exact wording here, but you said in early 2020, there's this virus emerging. But I think one of the things that you do well in the book is this kind of hierarchy or delineating what those risks are. And that's one of the key things that I think where your book really succeeds, is making that comparison.
Thanks, Robert. I'm very proud of the pandemic references in the book, because there are some, and I had it in there before coronavirus. I was looking at comparing climate change to other serious threats. I don't know if I'd call them existential threats, but certainly big threats, including obviously the big one, which is nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, which we can get to later. But
sure.
Certainly, to deal with the claims that get made that climate change is the biggest problem we face. Some say it's the biggest problem we've ever faced, which is an even more amazingly strong claim. Right. But the idea that climate change is the biggest problem we face is really the thing that I wanted to certainly confront and take down. I don't think it's the biggest environmental problem. It's much less the biggest human problem. And so the book wants to really settle that question before we then move on to, okay, what is the stuff that we want to worry about? And, to your point, I mean, what you and I share is that we want to tell human stories. We want to show that there's still 2 billion people about that burn wood or dung or biomass and have to not just breathe the smoke, but spend a significant portion of their lives having to go out and collect the biomass or the wood to use.
Right.
And that we've just kind of lost sight of them. And so we have a so-called environmental movement, which, it's not just that it's oblivious, as I point out, to these other problems in poor parts of the world, but is actively trying to maintain the biomass economy in much of the world. And that's a huge problem, and it's an injustice, and was really in some ways the deepest motivation for me in writing Apocalypse Never.
Well, let's talk about that, because that motivation, I've known each other. I think I was thinking about this today. I think I interviewed you and Ted maybe 12 years ago, something like that. Yeah. You co-founded Breakthrough Institute with Ted Nordhaus. And I was attracted back then to the messaging that you were putting forward, but a lot of it was around energy. So you mentioned Congo, you mentioned this. So you introduced us to a lot of characters, but I think Bernadette, I'm looking for her last name. I got my notes all over the place here. But Bernadette Simutaya lives near Virunga National Park. Tell us why her story is important, because again, I think that, putting a human approach to it and a human face on it, and talking about energy poverty as people like her are living it. Why is she important to you?
Yeah, she's sort of the moral center of the book. She's a subsistence farmer in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which I refer to as the Congo. And she is someone that I met there when I was visiting to understand the relationship between wood fuel, conservation, economic growth, and energy. And there's actually 3 characters in the book. She's the dominant one, but there's really 3 women. There's Bernadette, there's Suparti in Indonesia, who's a factory worker, and then there's my wife, Helen. And I talk about just how much more energy Helen uses. I talk about how different Helen's life is from Suparti and Bernadette. I wanted to, obviously, these are 3 characters. I'm not suggesting they represent all 7.5 billion people in the world, but they represent 3 dramatically different stages of economic development, and which are really different stages of energy and food production and consumption and cities. And I wanted to tell those stories as a way to also get at putting climate change into perspective, because climate change is not something that Bernadette worries about, nor Suparti for that matter, really. They have other concerns like staying alive for Bernadette. And for Suparti, it's making a living as a factory worker in Indonesia. And Helen has concerns too, but they're just not that they're not. And I wanted to dramatize those stories, and those characters run through the book, because I think we've forgotten, or we don't pay enough attention to it. And I think the climate discourse, especially in the United States and the Thunberg part of it, is just very first world. It's just very elite. And I didn't want to write a book sort of scolding young people for not caring enough about Africans, but I did want to give them compelling stories of Africans and Asians and Latin Americans around the world and what their lives are like, to put these environmental problems in some kind of perspective.
Sure. Well, so let me follow on that, because as I just mentioned, we've known each other a while, and you've got a fire in you. I mean, you really do. You've had it for a long time. You ran for governor of California. I don't know many people who, would, I mean, frankly. Yeah. So what is the motivation? And I ask that partly because as I recall, you were born in a Quaker house, or you were born in a Quaker home, or had a religious affiliation with the Quakers. Is that right?
Not quite. Let me unpack it though, because honestly, it's come up now. My Wikipedia page is currently misrepresenting my family history, and then a German newspaper just came out with something that also kind of got it wrong. And my parents are very distressed, as you might imagine. Okay,
sure. Set us straight.
But it's basically, So both of my parents were raised as Mennonites, which is a pacifist, anti-statist, communities. They're Amish are a sect of Mennonites. Not all Mennonites are Amish. Amish are Mennonites. My parents both left that tradition as they got older, but definitely, I mean, I was a left-wing kid, and it was definitely in the Christian pacifist tradition. I was attracted to liberation theology. You might remember, you might still have some Guatemalan fabrics from the liberation theology days of the 80s. So very much that view, the liberation theology views that you have a preferential option for the poor. And so your central concern should be for the poorest people in this society. And so for sure that the sense in which when I kind of gradually discovered how terrible most environmental policies are for the poorest people in the world, yes, that has been the fire. That is the fire of outrage against that injustice that has driven a lot of my work over the last 15 years and is definitely I think the driver of Apocalypse Never.
So is that what took you to Brazil?
Yeah, I mean, I was in love with Brazil as like a place. I mean, it was in part it was political.
And this was 1985, late 1980s?
I went to Nicaragua to work with the Sandinistas in the late in 1989. And then I went and I learned Portuguese because I wanted to be in Brazil because they had this incredible left-wing political movement called the Workers' Party and the Landless Workers Movement. And so then I spent the early 90s, I spent time in Brazil, and I was going to be an anthropologist, and I did a bunch of work in the Amazon, what they call the semi-Amazon, the very poor subsistence farming parts of Brazil, which were mostly former slaves, occupying, just doing the shittiest work. I mean, the hardest, shittiest work. And so when people kind of go, you know, what are those Brazilians doing? You know, cutting forests down, those terrible, greedy Brazilians. I'm kind of like, yeah, you know what? Oh, wait a second. Like,
you wrote about it in Forbes a few months ago about the fires in the Amazon, again, debunking this idea that the fires were out of the ordinary or larger than usual. I mean, am I recalling that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it was, so I've been writing, I've mostly been doing energy and climate, but I always wrote a little bit on Brazil, and I always kind of stayed, and it was in our book that I did with Ted that you mentioned earlier. But yeah, I mean, all the Amazon fire stuff was going on, and it was so wrong, and it was the reporting was so bad, it was so terrible, without context, without any history, without like a second opinion from anybody. I mean, it was just, most environmental journalism today is pretty terrible. That for literally not getting a second perspective. So I call up like one of my main sources, this guy Dan Nepstad. As you know from reading the book, most chapters have a more qualified environmentalist than me, or a scientist or somebody to talk about plastic waste. So I call him, he's the Amazon guy. And I'm like, so Dan, this thing about like the Amazon being the lungs of the planet, that's not right, is it? He was like, that's bullshit. And that I think that the bullshit, like him just calling bullshit. And he's like the biggest scientist, like the biggest, he was like lead author of the IPCC on the Amazon. And then we just go through and just debunk everything else. Just starting with the most important fact of it all is that Europe and the United States, we deforested everything, turned it all into farms. Like, how did you think we became rich, you idiotic, ahistorical, whatever people? I mean, I'm kind of like, these are like these college educated people at the New York Times and CNN. They all went to Swarthmore and Wesleyan, and yet they don't know the history of you just think I mean, it was the combination of how bad it was scientifically, plus how ahistorical it was, and how just imperialistic it is.
Right, and celebrities jumping on and saying, "Oh, the Amazon, and we're going to go and save it." But I want to go back to that idea about where you came from. Was from partly your own religious tradition, but it's interesting, the liberation theology movement, because I remember that very well. And it was Protestants and Catholics both. And, I think the Pope at the time of John Paul II cracked down on the liberation theologists in South America because he didn't like it, too radical. But what's interesting to me, and it's one of the things that I wrote down, was, so have you moved from the left to the right, or did the left move further left and leave you where you were? Right? Because your work, your book was reviewed in the Wall Street Journal. You've published in Quillette. I mean, you've been in many ways, I'm not going to say fully, but more accepted on the right than you have on the left. Am I reading that correctly?
Oh, for sure. And there's a way in which there's like a lot of this book is for conservatives. I want this book to be read by conservatives. I want to be read by Republicans. I'm excited to have conversations with conservatives and Republicans. But I don't think it's a conservative book, really.
No, and I'm not calling it. I'm not saying that it is. I'm just. To me, is interesting. You ran for governor, but how do you label your politics then, or do you even fit any kind of label now? Because I remember I wrote a piece about liberals and conservatives, and I got an email back. Don't call me a liberal. I'm a socialist.
Yeah.
Right. So, well, how would you define?
I didn't say that though.
No.
No,
That's you.
Oh, okay.
But how would you define your politics, given that the Democratic left, the traditional Democratic Party in America, dominated by environmentalists or anti-nuclear, have been claiming that we can just use renewables? Bernie Sanders, the Bernie bros, that's their position, right? And AOC, I think, to a large degree, although she seems to be coming around a little bit in terms of nuclear. But my question, how do you describe your own politics then?
Yeah, great question. Well, let me just say on the book, because
of course.
I wrote the book for so many different people. There were a lot of people on my mind while writing this book. First and foremost, my kids. My kids are 21 and 14. And so I want kids in between 14 and 21 to be able to read this book. So that's why it's full of little stories and characters, and that the main character in the plastics chapter is the woman who pulls the plastic straw out of the sea turtle nose. Like, I want kids to know that. Like, read this, just read the plastic waste chapter. If you only read one chapter, just read that chapter, right? So I want everybody to read it. I definitely had progressives on my mind that I was addressing a bunch of this stuff to, including the stuff about the poor. I did not deliberately choose all women of color as the main characters of the book. I didn't set out to do that, but that is who they are. And two of them are what we would consider poor, Bernadette and Supartie in Congo and Indonesia. But this is not there's a journey I want progressives to take by reading this book, and I hope that they will take. There's definitely a journey I want conservatives to take too. I'm obviously delighted to have readers from both camps. Sure. And there's sort of the question of my identity. I definitely, in this book, by the end, as you know, I work through a bunch of my own identity. And, just to come back to the religious part for a second, I feel like what I did, because I was never a good Christian. I was raised to be a Christian, but I was never a good Christian. But I became basically socialist, had a Marxist period, and then was social-ish. And I don't know. And now I would probably still say I'm a liberal in most ways on a bunch of things. But, you come out of it and you go, there's this thing I was trying to understand, which is why, if at bottom of so much apocalyptic environmentalism is a conservative political philosophy that comes from a guy named Malthus, if Malthus and Malthusianism are basically conservative, but yet it's been embraced on the left, how did that happen? Because you remember Marx and Engels hated Malthus. They condemned Malthus. Marx called Malthus a stain on the human race. So how do you get an accommodation then between the left, the socialist left, and this conservative Malthusian philosophy? And I describe how that occurs. And it was a stone in my shoe for 10 years because I couldn't figure out what happened. And I feel like I got to the bottom of it. It's maybe the only original thing in the book. The book wasn't aiming to be original. It's aiming to be comprehensive and rigorous. But
this Malthusianism, this still defines, in Greta and her email, her podcast talked about people living within planetary boundaries and almost lauding people living in Africa because they're living within planetary boundaries. And
Yeah, sure are.
right. And Swedes are not. So is that, you said you got to the bottom of this? Well, then a bottom of that, that belief system. So run me through that. Then what was it? How did you get to the bottom of it? How do you see it? What was that original?
Yeah. So the short version is that there's an accommodation made between socialists, who I think were Marxists. It was not totally clear, but they were definitely socialists, and Malthusians. There was an accommodation made. I don't know if it was ever like explicit, like if the two important characters who I describe in the book, Paul Ehrlich and Barry Commoner, I don't know if they ever got together and like shook on it. It was more like the outcome of arguments over time and between other people too, but they're the two characters I kind of track. And the deal is that, we're going to do things to basically try to reduce the standard of living and reduce the amount of energy that we consume in the rich world. And then the poor countries, they get a little bit richer.
Right.
They'll get solar panels and batteries on their huts, but then they'll sort of stay farmers.
Right.
And then we'll all kind of meet in the middle. And you kind of see this now in things they call the donut. They have this weird donut thing they do. It's bad and dumb, but it's like, it's that accommodation of kind of like, it's both redistributive and Malthusian. Because remember, Malthus was against helping the poor. Right. But so what happens then is that the World Bank and United Nations and all these institutions, that's when they move from funding roads, electrical systems, and dams to funding, democracy clinics and women's empowerment workshops and solar panels and batteries and organic farming, agroecological farming, and not funding fertilizers, tractors, irrigation systems. So that shift occurs at that period it really occurs after that sort of vision of a Malthusian social-ish agenda is put in place. So where do I come out on that? And what do I call it? Do I call it like liberal or conservative or left or right? In the book, I don't really get into it. I say what I really want to get to with the book is to argue that what I'm proposing is something that I think should be called environmental humanism, in the sense that humanism accepts human power and human goodness. And that really, to suggest that someone's going to make decisions on behalf of nature is a religious idea and a power move. And so that's the most important agenda there. I mean, I have other beliefs about things like we need more housing in California, and and the homelessness problem is like a moral abomination and an embarrassment and should be fixed. And that we probably need some kind of universal psychiatric care to help mentally ill people. You kind of put all my beliefs together and you go, I don't know, is that liberal? Yeah. Probably compared to most Republicans, it's pretty liberal.
Right.
But definitely I'm 48, I'm 49 now, Robert. So I'm not going to pull my punches on people that call themselves liberals and Democrats.
Sure. No, I get it, but you're in California. We'll come back to California in just a minute. But humanism, as you've talked about it, what came to mind was this idea of limiting human potential, right? By constraining energy supplies to the developing world. And what we've seen now in the last few years, the World Bank rejecting any funding for any kind of hydrocarbon projects, in NGOs in the US, Sierra Club and others working against OPIC, Export-Import Bank, to prevent any funding of these kinds of electrification projects if they're involving hydrocarbons, right? But that's a long way of getting to the point. But what I hear in your talking about environmental humanism is and you've made this, I think, the same line, a high energy planet, right? We want more energy because that's good for people. And that's why you're so pro-nuclear. So let's, that's a pivot. So nuclear, then you've been perhaps, I think, no doubt, not perhaps, among the world's most staunch advocates for not just keeping existing plants open, but in developing new ones. So what's your outlook for, let's just give me the rundown on where nuclear is now and what your outlook for it is.
Yeah, well, let me say something about nuclear.
Sure.
the book, there were some people that were like, is the book going to just rehash your articles from Forbes? And it does not do that. I mean, there will be things in the book that are familiar to people that read my Forbes articles, but I do go beyond that. And I will spoil a little bit of where it goes on nuclear just because you asked, and I think it's important. What I make clear, what I argue in this book is that that nuclear energy and humankind's capacity to split the atom and release this tremendous amount of energy is a revolutionary moment. And it's a radical, radical technological breakthrough of which they are very, very rare. I mean, as Václav Smil and everyone emphasizes, and you just look at it, you just go, there's just not, this is fundamental. Right. So this is fundamental, and nuclear is fundamental to energy, yes, and to war and weapons, and thus to the global system. And so in the gunpowder allowed for large standing armies, it allowed for the nation state. Nuclear energy allows for a tin pot dictatorship in North Korea to completely secure its borders against the most powerful country that has ever existed. And so that's radical. Like, that's radical. This weapon tames the fiercest of beasts. The United States and Soviet Union after World War II were just, it was looking terrifying, and the most violent men in the world, one could argue, are dealt with.
Have to restrain themselves.
And so it's such a radical, revolutionary technology. The most fundamental truth of it, which is what we've just been talking about, is so uncomfortable to people that it mostly doesn't get talked about. And so, but we have apocalyptic fears of this technology. And,
but the apocalyptic view is due to the weaponry, and that is difficult to separate from the energy part of it, right? And that's been one of the things that I think has really tainted the whole conversation, right? So you've been around the world, you've been in Taiwan, you've been in Korea, trying to save these nuclear plants while not just splitting the atom, but splitting that discussion, right? Just splitting the difference between, weaponry and energy. They're not the same, but you've made the argument that the weaponry is actually positive, which is I mean, on the face of it, it not something you originally would think of.
Well, yeah. I mean, actually, it's interesting. So yes, so the official position of nuclear advocates, and by which I include both the nuclear industry, but also the science and technical community and the random pro-nuclear environmentalists like myself, is that there's just nothing, these two things are completely different. There's just these nuclear power plants and there's these nuclear weapons. There's nothing that ties them together. And then the anti-nuclear people go, well, no, I mean, there's a kind of a shared knowledge base. There's the scientists themselves who know how to do these things. There's the process of using uranium for different things. If you enrich it at different levels,
sure.
If you enrich it to very high levels, you can make a bomb. If you enrich it to very low levels, it makes for a beautiful, the best form of energy. And that these two things, there was this original idea, even Oppenheimer, the father of the bomb, bought into a fantasy that we could denature uranium, that there would be some technical fix. We still see it with some nuclear entrepreneurs. They say, I've developed these reactors that are proliferation resistant, or that they're all, and fine. There might be things that you could try to thwart some inspector or something, but they're all trying to basically do something that's not true, which is to say that there's sort of a sharp break rather than a clear continuum between these things. So that's really
between the bomb and the reactor.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a scientist, if you kind of go, if we want to get rid of nuclear, if you really want to try to get rid of nuclear, we figure this is, by the way, there's these the scholars at Yale and Harvard, after the bomb was used in 1945, they kind of get together with these workshops and they figure out, like, right away, like within days of this, I mean, weeks, they kind of go, look, they're like, it doesn't seem like any nation that has the bomb, or it doesn't seem like any nations that have the bomb would ever be able to get rid of them, because what would happen if two countries that had the bomb got rid of them and then went to war? everybody says the same thing. They're going to race to rebuild their nuclear bombs. Of course, that's what you'll do. So then the risk would be that they would use them on each other in war. And so the political scientists, they were like, so it would be better to not get rid of them,
right.
you know? So they realized this in 1945, but that creates huge psychological, I mean, that's a very psychologically challenging idea.
Because doomsday is always around the corner.
Yeah, there's always the potential that as long as they exist, there's always some potential that they could be used.
Right.
Now, and then the early scenarios were just insane. I mean, they still are, really. I mean, that's part of the logic of it. I mean, they don't need to be that insane, but it was like, so there was this idea that if they were used in war, that it would be the end of the world. And there's some questions around that. I don't really explore it very much, but suffice it to say, nuclear just became the, justifiably and unjustifiably the symbol of the apocalypse.
Right.
So you can just try to ignore it or pretend it's not there or whatever. But I think what ends up happening is that it then seeps into the unconscious, and it then manifests in a fear of nuclear power plants. So for me, now it's been 10 years, I've been pro-nuclear for 10 years, and having talked to a lot of people and read, studied the heck out of this thing, I'm convinced that it's much better to just have the conversation about what the significance of these weapons are. Because even if you kind of go, they've, because we were in this period of incredible peace, but
right.
since World War II, and the declining death toll from wars and battles, there's still wars and battles, but the deaths from them are much lower. I mean, India and Pakistan have these battles, and
right.
I mean, India and China just had this little skirmish, and it's kind of like,
but it's a few dozen killed, not thousands.
Yeah, and they're kind of like, no, that's going to be small. Like, it's kind of like,
right. So, but let's transition from, because going from that weaponry argument, or saying that actually, and I'm going to paraphrase what you're saying, is that actually the nuclear weaponry is actually a force for peace, or a force for stability, if not peace. But so then handicap nuclear for me, because I'm adamantly pro-nuclear, but I also see it facing just challenges all over the country. And when you look at its share of primary energy going back to the 1980s, has not captured on a percentage basis any increase in overall primary energy. So the short question, what's needed for nuclear then to really prosper in the next few decades to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, first and foremost is that there has to be a consciousness shift on nuclear. I mean, I don't think that there's some fundamental technological problem with the particular fuel coolant combination that is dominant, which is using these uranium fuel rods,
right,
and water. And there's a lot of ideas out there. We've done a history of them. We've demonstrated many, many different kinds of reactors. The United States has demonstrated many, many different kinds of reactors. The Soviets had an independent nuclear program, as did the French and the British, as have the Argentinians and others. Right. And we keep coming back to light water, which are we come back to water-cooled uranium, because in part because there's so much experience with it. We have these supply chains. We know how to use it. So in terms of the technology, I don't think we have a problem with the technology. Now, in places where there's less cheap natural gas, there's much more support for nuclear. Sure. At most levels. Even in South Korea, the public support is much higher than the support among the government for nuclear. Japan's different. So in Britain right now, my view is Britain is the most important country in the West for nuclear, because it's building two French, they call them EPR reactors, full-sized reactors. I guess they're 1,000 megawatts each. And they're considering
Hinkley C, right?
At Hinkley Point C. Yeah. Like all construction projects, everything from, yes, nuclear power plants, but also to train stations, train lines, the Channel, the Olympics, stadiums, and the like. It's going way over budget, but the British are nonetheless considering building 4 new reactors, 2 at Sizewell and 2 at Moorside, that would be identical to those 2 reactors we're building now and would use the same construction crews, the same construction managers, the same guys pouring cement and doing rebar and doing pipe welds.
Following the French model of unifying the fleet around one design.
So all we know about nuclear economics is one thing, which is that the only way to bring down costs, same people building the same kind of reactor over and over again. That's all we know. Anything else that people claim about the economics of nuclear, like some better fuel or coolant combination, is not based in history, empirical research data. Okay, so all we know is that that British model, which is the French model, which was the US model, which is also the Japanese and the South Korean model, every time they do that, the costs come down. So that's all we know. So then you kind of go, well, what's going to happen in the United States? How fast can there be a consciousness shift in the United States? How fast can we get people to appreciate?
But is it a consciousness shift, or because I look at this issue in the United States, and let me just pivot away from the U.S. because you said Britain is the most important country now, but where most of the electric demand growth, and I was looking at the new BP statistical review numbers, the overwhelming majority of the demand growth for electricity, for energy in general, is in South Asia and in Africa. So I agree that it's important to prove these reactors and build them in the US and in Britain, but that's not where the growth is globally. So how do we get, India to ramp up and to move, use less coal, China's moving, building the most reactors of any country in the world. But what about Bangladesh? What about Pakistan? What about, these other countries where huge population growth is in now and forecast for the future and huge electric demand? How do we get nuclear in those places? Because that to me seems like the bigger challenge.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so let's see. So Vietnam and South Africa, they both considered big nuclear buildouts. They decided not to. They had different reasons for it. In Vietnam, it appears to be a combination of it being maybe more power than they thought they needed, it being maybe too close to Russia than they wanted to be, and maybe also some internal political factors around the benefits of coal versus using nuclear. South Africa, there was corruption claims that were being made, which I'm not sure how definitive those were as a factor, because there's corruption in a lot of different industries.
Sure.
Also in coal, there's a lot of corruption. I realize my neighbor's about to saw. Can you hear that? Should I move?
I can't hear it.
Okay, great. So those are 2 developing countries where would it have been, like, if the United States, for example, had been offering to build AP1000s in the same way that everybody offers to build them, which is that we would finance them, or the World Bank would do its job and finance the nuclear plants in South Africa and in Vietnam, just like they ought to finance hydroelectric dams in the Congo, if they actually did what they're supposed to do, which is why they created the World Bank in the first place, then we would have nuclear there. Like that full story. I mean, end of story. Like that's all you would need. Like that's all those 2 countries. If the United States were like, look, we'll do nuclear and we'll do it at the same price as you think you're going to get coal or natural gas, we would have built them, and it would have been fantastic for Bechtel, which is who would build the plants if we built them.
Right.
The French could do the same thing, and it would be fantastic for the French. So why don't they do that? Because of political reasons, which are basically based on these perceptual and consciousness reasons that I keep coming back to. In other words, if the World Bank had not been, Malthusianized, defenestrated, isn't defenestrate mean something like that?
Thrown out the window. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And if the United States had a nuclear industry that had some fighting spirit, rather than effectively being in a state of depression and resignation and managed decline, as I testified to Congress earlier this year about the state of the U.S. nuclear industry, then I think it would have been a very different game, But these are,
but it's hard. But I mean, ultimately, isn't just it's hearts and minds. I mean, but I think that the conversation is starting to shift, and I think that the pro-nuclear people are gaining traction, but they aren't gaining traction. Let me switch to talk about renewables here, because you've also written, a tremendous amount in the book about renewables, and that's one of the things that I've been focused on as well. And why? So we've talked about the problems with nuclear and why its acceptability has been problematic.
Right.
for years. Why are renewables so popular? What is it that gives that solar and wind? And so two questions. Why are they so popular? And why are environmentalists so easily or rejecting any discussion of effects on landscape, wildlife, and people?
Well, now we get back to the spiritual questions again. Yeah, I mean, so just today, a new Pew poll came out, and I looked at the numbers on nuclear, solar, and wind. And solar and wind are at like 90%, 80% support. It's like 90% support for solar, 80% support for wind, and nuclear is at like 40% or 50%. Sure. I think it's like keeping nuclear plants open is much more popular among everybody than building new ones. Yeah. But it's very low. So you kind of go, well, that's all the explanation you need for nuclear's problems. You don't have to make up some story about why somehow cooling your uranium cores with water is the core of nuclear's problems. The problem is that people don't like nuclear and they love solar and wind. And why is that? It's because people know absolutely nothing about any of them. They know zero for the majority of people, right? So I'm just saying Bill McKibben knows plenty and Greta Thunberg knows enough to show more intellectual responsibility than she's showing on nuclear and renewables. But most people, they go, sunlight and wind are good and harmless, and I like them, and therefore I like those technologies. That's it. That's all it means. For a harder group of environmentalists, it is about harmonizing with nature, and they want to do that for what I ultimately conclude are religious reasons.
Right.
Is spiritual reasons.
Well, right, but there's that disconnect, and it's one that I keep. A lot of my work lately has been on this very same thing. Well, what about the effect on migratory birds? I mean, the Trump administration has effectively said we're not going to enforce the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. I've interviewed Merlin Tuttle, world-renowned bat expert, says the effect on bats, and several projects have been delayed or killed because of potential effects on bats. I mean, the effects are deadly. So there's this disconnect, and we like the idea of wind and solar. Well, what about the birds and the bats? Climate change, and that somehow trumps that, which to me, I struggle to understand why that there's such an easy acceptance of the destruction of rural landscapes, the destruction of wildlife and flying mammals and birds, and also just the effect on rural communities. And it just seems like it's not even part of the discussion among the renewable advocates.
Yes. Well, what's interesting is that it has been an issue, right? So from the beginning, it's been a huge issue, massive issue. The wind industry certainly thinks it's a massive issue. They've invested huge amounts of money. I mean, the amount of money the wind industry gives to environmental organizations is astonishing. The amount of money they spend on hiring scientists to come to conclusions that fit what they want to say to the public is astonishing. They've created a huge new organization to just do propaganda for the wind industry about the science of this stuff. It's incredibly daunting when you look at it all, but it all boils down to basically the same kind of tactics that all destructive industries use when they're abusing the environment, which is to basically deny that their impacts are significant, suggest that other things are worse, and play up the uncertainties. But it is changing. I will say two big things have happened just in the last 2 weeks. The first was the decision by a judge to curtail wind turbine activity on Lake Erie, which was this hugely contested thing. This is like one of the great birding lakes, of course. Like it's a famous Black Swamp Observatory is there. I think you may have written about it in your book. The impacts would have been just horrible, right? On like these amazing migratory bird species, right? That everybody goes and sees every year. So the judge said, or it was the regulator, it may have been a judge in the second case, said you have to stop you have to prevent the blades from spinning and chopping up birds at certain times. I think, was it just at night or just during certain seasons?
It's just at night. It's the Icebreaker Wind Project on Lake Erie, which would be the first one in the Great Lakes. I mean, it's been talked about now for a decade, but this is the first one that's gotten kind of a
which if you just say to an environmentalist, we're going to go put a big industrial energy project in the middle of Lake Erie, In any other technology, they would have been like, what? No. Like if you'd been like, we're going to put a natural gas facility there or a nuclear reactor in Lake Erie, oh my God, it would have been like front page New York Times editorials every week attacking it. There would have been NRDC direct mail asking you for money to stop the energy project on Lake Erie because it's wind and it's a spiritual quest. But anyway, what's important is that I think because you have been also working, you've done this much longer and better than I have for so long. So you deserve much more of the credit for it. And I think it's been frustrating. On the other hand, two of these rulings, the one that says they can't run the turbines at night, which means the project's not economically viable, which in some ways is like a sweet troll. You know, it's kind of like, oh yeah, you can run those turbines when they're not going to kill a lot of birds.
Several $100 million, but you're going to lose your money.
Yeah, exactly. It's such a sweet troll. And then the second one is that the judge killed this big, it's going to go back.
Transmission line in Nebraska, the transmission project through the sandwich.
Yeah. I mean, if you Google whooping crane mortality, you will come across, the first paper you'll find will tell you that the greatest source, non-natural source of whooping crane mortality is transmission lines.
Right.
So you kind of go, well, last time I checked, there was only 15 whooping cranes left. Okay, I'm exaggerating. There's 1,000, but there's not their population is clearly in trouble, at a genetic viability level. So they're the whooping cranes get all this attention. We looked into Lisa Leno's, who's a character in my book, someone that you've known, you introduced me to, I think. She looked into all that literature and was like, man, all the stuff that got all the Hollywood movies, the guys trying to fly with the whooping cranes, with the planes and the ultralights and training them and imprinting them, really has not brought the population, has not increased the population significantly. The species in serious trouble. And yet every major environmental group in the United States has been like, yeah, let's go just build a transmission lines across basically the entirety of Nebraska, the entire whooping crane habitat.
Right. But it's part of the disconnect. But the disconnect is particularly prominent in California. I mean, are you born and raised in California, by the way?
No, I came here after college.
Right. So you've lived there for most of your life, but this disconnect between the land use. I mean, you can't build wind projects effectively in California. The Tehachapi, speaking of transmission, Tehachapi transmission project took 10 or 12 years, $2 billion. I mean, the idea that you're going to be able to make some quick transition is the other part of this. Oh, we only have 10 years. AOC, you make the same point in the beginning. I'm talking to, I reintroduced Michael Shellenberger. We're talking about his new book, Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. But you talk about this, we only have 10 years. We only have 12 years. But the idea that we're going to make a quick transition and we're going to switch to renewables, particularly in a state like California, where you can't really build anything. I mean, because of CEQA, because of all the other rules there, that what's interesting to me about the renewable push is that it is strongest in some of the most heavily democratic states that are effectively where it's effectively impossible to build much new renewable capacity. And it's part of that disconnect. Am I missing something?
No, you got it spot on, Robert. I mean, as you and I both agree, I go further. I mean, people go, I used to say renewables aren't fast enough or something. I don't, now I go, they're too fast. It's taking us in this terrible direction. You can't, one of the things I did in this book, by the way, is that I tried to rely as much as I could on other sources than my own organization. And I did that deliberately because I wanted people to read the book and be like, this is based on the consensus science, whatever.
Sure.
Not on Shellenberger just running some Excel spreadsheets. When we did do some of our own calculations, but whatever. But the point I'm making is that Václav Smil, who is kind of widely viewed as the big energy analyst of the day. I mean, he's kind of more books than anybody, more articles. Bill Gates says he's the guy whose books he most looks forward to reading.
Right.
Everybody respects him. You and I know him and respect the hell out of him, right?
Sure.
I don't agree with him on a whole bunch of stuff. He's a Malthusian. His last book is completely Malthusian. I don't agree with the implications of what he finds, but his analyses, everybody kind of agrees and we reproduce them and they're amazing. So he writes this whole book on power density and he goes, right now our current energy system uses 0.5% of land.
Right.
If you were to go to 100% renewables for all your energy, it would be 25 to 50% of US land and most nations' land.
Sure.
Now you kind of go, well, maybe Václav had a bad day or something, and that statistic can't be right. But everybody comes to the same amount. David Mackay in his book,
right,
Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, 2009, I think, same calculations. And then my staff and you do them because you can do them with an Excel spreadsheet, and it's always 2 orders of magnitude. So it's hundreds of times more land to produce the same amount of energy out of a wind farm or a solar farm out as a natural gas or a nuclear plant. So I think we have to because this is an argument that I'm having, and I'm not going to get into kind of who I'm having it with, but there are some people who want to suggest that the renewables, that we will eventually be able to transition to renewables.
Right.
It's happening too slowly. That we need renewables.
And if we only had the political will, we could do it.
Yeah, we only have the political will, and that we need them, need them environmentally. And so this book just demolishes that. And it even shows that when France tries to go from nuclear to renewables, the carbon intensity of electricity goes up because they had to burn more natural gas to deal with the unreliability.
Well, so let me just return. We've been talking for an hour, and I don't want to don't want to take your whole day, but that was one of your position on the renewables got you again going back to your where you fit politically on Tucker Carlson's show. I mean, 10 years ago, could you have ever imagined being on Tucker Carlson's show? I mean, or
Robert, it was incredibly controversial for me to go on Tucker Carlson's show. I mean, speaking of this current, I've said some choice things about some of the impulse to censor that's in our culture right now. But among my friends, people that I went to college with and who know me in my heart, telling me that I shouldn't go on Tucker Carlson, I shouldn't do that because Tucker Carlson has all these terrible ideas. And it's like, first of all, I'm sorry, did I go on Tucker Carlson and agree with all of his ideas? I was invited to a show. And second of all, when Rachel Maddow wants to have me on, I am game to go on Rachel Maddow or Chris Hayes or anybody. I mean, I talk to everybody. So but it was like, honestly, I was offended by the reaction from my progressive friends that I shouldn't go on Tucker Carlson. So that's to get back to your original question, which where you're sort of like, are you liberal conservative? This thing where you're not supposed to talk to people.
Right.
It's toxic and it's noxious and it's obnoxious and it's offensive and I hate it. And I'm never going to comply with it. And if it means that, I lose some support or friends or whatever, then they're not my friends. I'm not going to do that. So anyway, yes, I go on Tucker Carlson. It is shocking. And you do pause for a minute. It's kind of, well, how far would you go? What if Adolf Hitler had a Fox?
We're going to go to
Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler must have you on Fox News tonight.
He has a new podcast.
You're kind of like, well, I don't know. I mean, can I challenge him about the Holocaust while I'm on it?
Yeah.
Or like,
okay, so I'm going to make the transition from Hitler to Michael Moore. Okay, so how important was Planet of the Humans? You wrote a scathing review in Forbes. Scathing, I guess. I think my personal bias is, it in some ways marks a turning point. I think because it's the left showing the left that when it comes to energy, I thought it's a deeply Malthusian anti-human film. I didn't like that part of it. But what do you think? Was it an important film? How does it stack up for you?
Oh, huge. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's a hugely significant moment, hugely significant film. What the film shows is the environmentally destructive impact of renewables. That's what the movie's actually about. Then they say things in it, that are like obviously wrong, like too many people, and this is a problem of capitalism. It's like, well, is it a problem of capitalism? In other words, would wind and solar farms require less land under a socialist society? Just curious, it's like, and nuclear power requires more land under whatever. I mean, it's just wrong and
right.
Kind of dumb.
There's a lot of things in the film that didn't like. But I think just the way the urge to censor it And the fact that it was Josh Fox and Michael Mann and some of the other leading lights of the climate movement saying, "Oh, this film is dangerous." To me, that was even in some ways more interesting than the film itself, because it was this effort to restrain the discussion, right? To limit the parameters of what's acceptable to talk about. So look, again, we've been on for about an hour. So let me just let me ask you just.
You know what, Robert? We can see you. I love talking to you, and I don't care if anybody listens to this, man. I just love talking to you. You were, you know what, man? You were ahead of us on a lot of this stuff. You were saying this stuff long before we were, and you deserve a huge amount of credit for having created this moment. I know it's been frustrating. I hear you kind of talking about how nobody gets the renewables, and and I agree, it's terrible, but it's also like, it's kind of inevitable. I mean, I kind of there's a part of me that goes, it's just, I'm sorry, but I don't think 20 years from now, we're going to still be here being like, everybody's still wrong about renewables. I mean, in part because, first of all, we did a lot of renewables. I mean, this is not 15, 20 years ago.
I think that they're already running into the limits
and they're running into limits.
Social acceptability. I mean, Bloomberg News had a piece on Friday about Norway, and when the first line said that the Norwegian government is backing off of wind because of, the line was massive protests. And the same thing, you've written about this as well, in Germany and in New York. In fact, I've written about this, that wind projects are so unpopular in New York State, which has a 70% clean energy mandate by 2030 and 100% by 2040. And they're, of course, closing Indian Point. They're going to close at Diablo Canyon in California. But the wind projects were so, the plan is to close Diablo Point. Okay. But the wind projects are so unpopular in New York State that the state had to pass a rider on the state budget that effectively strips local communities of zoning authority. And they just are going to cram these projects down on local landowners because it's part of this urban-rural divide where, we'll just put it out there, right? There's nobody out there. Well, forget them. They're probably Republicans anyway. So, forget them.
I think that's part of it. Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I think, for sure. Look, things are changing. I mean, Germany, the wind industry is basically shut down because of the transmission problem. Right. And they kind of go hydrogen. You say they go there. That's the new thing. They go. This is not working. We produce twice as much, garbage electricity basically in California as we did last year, and twice as much last year as we did the year before. Meaning garbage electricity, meaning electricity produced by solar panels. Yay! That the electricity, there's no demand for it, so we have to pay Arizona to take it from us. And so now Arizona's like, okay, God, I guess we'll try to make some hydrogen with it, because that's it's like a mess. And then, of course, we killed a wind project. I'm not taking credit for it. California killed a wind project in Humboldt County, our most environmentally dogmatic county. The Nebraska line was killed by a judge. The Windbreaker project. I mean, you kind of look at it and you go, boy, it doesn't look great for those projects. And then I just kind of go, it's just inevitable that I feel the same way about nuclear. So for me, you kind of go, and I kind of go, I don't know. Like, I don't know. How long will it take? I'm like, I don't know. Is the U.S. nuclear industry going to actually fight for its technology or not? Because that would be what determines whether the technology does well. Is it going to sit there and pretend like renewables are good for another 20 years? And you kind of go, and is AOC going to change her mind? I mean, what's stopping her from just leading progressives to be pro-nuclear? I mean, come on. I can't believe she has the phobia that Bernie Sanders has. Yeah. I mean, come on.
You can't build wind turbines in Vermont either, by the way. The only pending project was the regulator shot it down earlier this year. Yeah. Well, so back to you. So enough about me. So what about, are you going to run for governor again?
Oh, man. I don't know. I don't know if I will. I have a lot of reasons not to. What I'm committed to, what I'm really committed to is actually trying to deal with this problem that we have, which is that we have, over 100,000 people living on the street, many of them suffering from severe mental illness. using methamphetamine and heroin that we're subsidizing directly and indirectly. There's no psychiatrist in the world that thinks that it's good for people with schizophrenia to take methamphetamine and heroin and live on the street. It's really bad, very, very bad. It's immoral. We're not building housing for young people, and we're being selfish jerks. And so I'm committed to seeing that change. And so I am going to, after this book, I don't think I'm going to write ever another book on the environment. I really don't. I'm going to write about the environment for the rest of my life. I care about it. I'm going to write about this book. But I mean, I do want to also address some other things that I care about, including these questions of what do we owe each other as fellow Americans? What is our duty to these people, the poorest people in the society, people with severe mental illness? These are concerns I have. And the board of directors of Environmental Progress, in fact, has decided that we are going to work to expand the stuff that we work on. And so in answer to your question, I don't know about the governor thing, but I am definitely committed to addressing the problems we have here, because frankly, it's just here in my home, and I love the state, and it's a big wreck and a disaster, and it needs to be fixed. And so that's what I'm committed to. And without formally announcing it, that is my strong intention is for my next book to be about the crisis in California.
Well, and that's something that I've been looking at a little bit myself, because I find it just fascinating that, and people don't know this, that California has the highest poverty rate in America outside of Washington, D.C. When you account for living standards, or costs of living rather, California has the highest poverty rate. And you and I talked both with Jennifer Hernandez and John Gamboa about this climate redlining issue, which is something that I find very concerning, because you throughout the book, and the book, of course, is Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All, from HarperCollins. Buy it on your Kindle, buy it on Amazon, buy it on bn.com.
Buy the hardcover because it's a better read.
Yeah, agreed. But that cost of energy is a key factor as well, and the cost of housing is a key factor. But these are the same issues that what I'm going to paraphrase, or talk about what you saw in the book, and the struggle to survive. It's becoming more acute for more people in your home state, and that's the challenge for California in terms of housing and energy, given the constraints, I think, are just enormous.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just the crazy thing is such a blessed state. It's just so well endowed and so well resourced. And it has we attract the greatest talent and the greatest people in the world. And yet we're destroying our cities with these large open air drug encampments of mostly severely mentally ill and deeply traumatized people. And disproportionately people of color. So the things that we profess to care about so much in California, civil rights, the poor, the environment, inequality, we're the worst in many of those metrics. And it's a warning. And I think there's some important lessons there. But, the ways in which the environment has been used to do bad things is something that those of us that care a lot about the environment have to speak out on. We have a very particular moral duty to speak out against the abuses of the goodwill that most people have to wanting to save endangered species, the great apes, the whales, the penguins, the species I write about in the book, these magnificent species. Most people want to save them. So to do bad things in the name of saving species like that, I think is quite, is really, you can see it's what motivated and drove me to do the book, because I think it's very manipulative to be getting 14 and 15-year-old children in the street, suffering, frankly, already rising levels of anxiety from toxic social media and all the other things that teenagers have to deal with today, to then go and tell them that there's not going to be a world for them in 10 years, to go and tell them things about polar bears that are not true, it's really wrong. It's just wrong. And so I was like, that's what I wanted to speak out on. And it's happening again in California. You just see it, really denying people the housing that they need because of using environmental, building an apartment building in an already developed part of the inner city makes the environment better, not worse. That's like, it's like the stuff in the book. You kind of go, keeping people using wood fuel rather than building a hydroelectric dam makes the environment worse. Right. People need to understand why that is. And if you care about the environment passionately, once you understand that, you'll care about stopping or in this case, promoting the kinds of nature-saving activities and human fulfillment increasing activities that we know work.
Well, I think that's a good summary, and I think that to repeat your line about the need for environmental humanism instead of apocalyptic environmentalism, I think that's it, and I think that's where our commonality is, that we just need to bring a more humanist approach to all of these discussions, and how does it affect people, and when that affecting people and wildlife and landscapes, those things matter. And it's not just about policy. It's got to be policy and thinking about that policy and how it affects human beings and their well-being is something that it's a long fight. And there's a way in which I did the part of this book that is for conservatives, that I wrote for conservatives, that I wanted to be a message to conservatives and just an appeal, was sort of like, stop. Like, so much of the conservative objections to apocalyptic environmentalism has been in the name of defending markets. Yeah.
Okay. In the book, I talk about the importance of functioning markets to save the whales. I get it, right? And functioning markets made natural gas cheaper than coal, and that allowed for natural gas to replace coal. But markets are in service of something. If markets didn't produce positive things, we wouldn't have them. So we need to actually... And markets aren't everything. There's also a role for government, and there's a role for the World Bank, and there's a role for financing like roads, and you kind of go like roads and electrical grids and hydroelectric dams. They're not really ever built by the free market. They're built often by governments working, with banks, and it's a decision by the societies of those countries that they want to be modern, and they want modern infrastructure. And so, I do have that conversation in there where I kind of go, the reaction to the Malthusian left by the right was very, I think, confusing in the sense it wasn't humanistic. It was actually more like markets.
Instead of conservation.
Instead of humans and nature in a simpler way. I mean, that's why you and I think are both very inspired by one of the characters in my book, Jesse Ossipal.
Yep.
Jesse is in some ways, he just got this better than anybody by kind of unpacking. That's why it's more like, look, it's a physical, it's like the same thing I was saying about how solar farms are not more power dense in socialist societies. It's kind of like, it's a physical process. You add fertilizer to the earth, and you produce more food. So if you're not going to let poor countries use fertilizer, how are you going to produce more food on less land? It doesn't really make sense, does it? That's the level at which I wanted this book to strike. Yeah. I wanted to get away from the ideology. I'm not going to say it's post-ideological. I'm not sure such a thing is possible. You have to have some framework with it.
Sure.
But I think if you read this book, I don't think anybody's going to walk away being like, that's a treatise for capitalism, or that's a socialist thing.
What I hear you saying, and this is where I think we're, in violent agreement here, is that you're pinning it down to what's the footprint. And that's what Jesse Ossipal's work did for me early on, was make me understand, and Smill as well, what's the power density? What's the footprint for what you need? Because the energy is the fundamental building block for all of culture, but it's fundamental to human well-being. And that I think is the point that, underlying all of Apocalypse Never is this idea that we have to be cognizant of that footprint, and it matters to Bernadette and her crops being eaten by baboons from the park and the rest of it. But it's all of a piece. And as you say, that we need these dense sources of energy to fuel our cities and to fuel our culture, because otherwise it's going to fall apart. So, look, we could talk a long time, Michael, and we have, and I'm sure we will in the future, but I'm going to draw it to a close. The book is Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. It's from HarperCollins. It's Michael Shellenberger's new book. Is this number 2, number 3?
Number 2.
Number 2. Okay.
It's but in some ways it feels like it's my first sole byline. So in some ways it feels like my first book.
Well, and as I said, I gave you a blurb for it. It's a master class in reporting and humanism,
Thanks so
and
much.
I commend you for it, because it really is a remarkable and I think really the culmination of your entire career. I mean, you poured all your experience into it, and for that reason alone, I think it's definitely worth reading. So, okay, so I'm going to close it out here. Thanks to all of you for tuning in to the Power Hungry podcast. Buy my books, watch my movie. The movie's Juice: How Electricity Explains the World. The book is out since March, called A Question of Power. You can find me on the interweb, the Google, the rest of it, robertbryce.com, or follow the movie at juicethemovie.com. Michael Shellenberger, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Robert.
This has been the Power Hungry podcast. We'll see you all next time.